Hello and welcome, everybody. This is lesson 9-6, the issues of the 70s. We looked at the presidency of Richard Nixon over the last 2 days, and now we're going to pick up with his successors, Gerald Ford and then Jimmy Carter. Gerald Ford was sworn into the presidency after the resignation of President Nixon. Now, Ford inherited a lot of problems. This was a nation that was still recovering from the trauma of Vietnam. The domestic situation was not great. We were suffering from high unemployment due to the actions of OPEC and the cutting of government spending, and still wrestling with the problem of inflation. The economy was in trouble. Now, President Ford, as a part of his strategy to address these problems, pardoned Nixon of, quote, any crimes which he may have committed. Now, this step will virtually guarantee that Gerald Ford will not win the presidential election of 1976. He is sacrificing his own re-election here, and we should respect the fact that he was willing to do that. But he knew that in order to tackle the problems of today, the problems that the nation was facing that year, right then, the urgent issues, he needed to get the nation past it. And a presidential pardon is a powerful thing. Nixon could not have further investigations or judicial action against him. It was done. We were moving on. The nation needed to shift its focus. Now, Ford's nomination does get challenged by another Republican. Ronald Reagan will run against Gerald Ford and will say, I'm better equipped to lead the Republican Party going forward. By a narrow margin, Gerald Ford will secure the nomination of his party for a second term, but in that election, he does get defeated fairly easily by the former governor of Georgia, this man right here, Jimmy Carter, who kind of famously, before he was governor of Georgia, was a peanut farmer. So he is our peanut farmer president. Now, Jimmy Carter, as president, promised that he would never tell a lie and that his presidency would focus on honesty in government and human rights around the world. And Carter went out of his way to say to the public that he was not your typical politician. Now, by saying not your typical politician, he meant to say, I'm not corrupt. I have your interests at heart. Other politicians, those are bad people, but I'm one of you. Jimmy Carter, however, did not have a lot of foresight with this. He had to work with politicians. As president, that was his job. And a lot of people in Congress did not like the fact that the president of the United States was essentially calling them corrupt and working against the American interests. And therefore, they would not be willing partners in enacting the policies of President Jimmy Carter. The greater problem here is that there were a lot of issues that the nation needed to face. Carter's greater challenge was the energy crisis. If you remember, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had cut shipments to the United States and increased prices. Oil was extremely expensive, and it created a tremendous gas shortage throughout the United States. Carter's response to that was to increase energy production by focusing on mining more coal, building nuclear power plants, and increasing America's use of solar energy. When OPEC raised prices again, it became clear that Jimmy Carter's long-term solution might work in the long term, but it was not going to fix the short-term problem. The gas shortage became more severe. Prices went up even higher, and the new energy plants were not ready to address the issues of today. Carter also failed to reduce unemployment. Unemployment had begun under Nixon and was getting to be a serious problem. Carter increased government spending to try to create more government jobs, but as we had learned back with Nixon cut spending to reduce inflation. Carter is going to increase in spending, and inflation is going to jump high, above 10%. That means what you can buy for $1 today is going to cost $1.10 next year. It's going to cost $1.21 the year after that. Prices are rising and rising quickly, and that cuts into people's savings and it hurts the economy. And then, just to smack the US in the face, when the oil prices were raised again by OPEC, so many businesses closed because of those increased costs that unemployment increased even though government spending increased. So unemployment was going up during the Carter years, just as inflation was going up. And the American economy was in serious problem. So maybe his foreign policy will save him. Well, Carter did have greater success in foreign policy. Things did go better for him there. He was able to improve relationships with Latin America. Latin America had done a number of not so friendly, nice things to Latin America, going all the way back to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s. And Carter wanted to fix that relationship. And one way that he did that was he gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. He also increased trade with Latin American countries. And this increase of trade actually exceeded the lost revenue from controlling the Panama Canal. So American economy did a little bit better in that deal. He also organized the Camp David Accords. This will end 30 years of conflict between Egypt and Israel. For 30 years, those two nations, led by Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, had been either fighting actual wars or on the verge of war with each other. And since the Camp David Accords, Israel and Egypt have been on good, peaceful terms. So Carter did have some success there. Carter was also an environmental president. The environmental movement had seen little progress since it started back in the Johnson days. Nixon, Ford, and Carter all made protecting the environment a goal of theirs, though. But there were setbacks. In 1969, there was a large oil spill that helped to encourage laws to reduce air and water pollution. The Clean Air and Clean Water Act were passed partially as a result of this large oil spill. But the setbacks included, of course, the actions of OPEC, the oil spill, all impacting American oil, which had helped focus the U.S. on using other forms of energy. One of these forms of energy was nuclear. We were building more and more nuclear power plants throughout the United States to reduce our dependence on oil. But then in 1979, Jimmy Carter just can't catch a break. There's an incident at a nuclear reactor on 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania. This incident created a small leak of radioactive material. It caused the shutdown of this plant. And as Americans realized, hey, these nuclear power plants might leak radiation, which can get into our air, get into our water, get into our bodies, and impact our health. Maybe we shouldn't be doing those. This was a relatively minor incident. The 3 Mile Island incident was not a major catastrophe, but it got into Americans' heads, and it convinced the U.S. to abandon nuclear energy. And the United States has built, the United States for 30 years did not build any nuclear power plants. We are currently in the process of building a few now, but nuclear energy has not been a major part of U.S. energy since that time. So, with Jimmy Carter's presidency largely a failure, the U.S. economy continuing to struggle, the only thing Carter could point to were his foreign policy credentials. So when he ran for re-election, he ran as a foreign policy president, the guy that brought peace between Israel and Egypt. But again, Jimmy Carter can't catch a break, and it will be a foreign policy disaster that ensures that he loses his re-election. In 1979, students in Iran will overthrow the American-supported Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was a dictator that we had supported because of his opposition to communism. These are still Cold War days, but he was not a popular leader. Remember the Cold War, the United States frequently winds up supporting the bad guys. We supported a not very popular guy in Iran, and these students overthrow that government. This spurs what we call the Iranian Revolution and the Iranian hostage crisis. This revolution erupts because of the U.S. support of a dictator. And in the overthrow of this election, students storm the United States Embassy, our offices in Iran, and take 66 hostages at that embassy. Now, Carter will eventually be able to negotiate their release, but it will be too late to save his presidency. Voters have already decided overwhelmingly that Jimmy Carter should no longer be president of the United States, and Ronald Reagan and a whole new era for America is ushered in 1980. We'll be getting to that in our next unit. This wraps up our unit on the troubled times of the 60s and 70s. I hope you learned something, and farewell.